GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
Are you ready for this? Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. Yeah.
Come on.
Good evening, good evening, good evening. It's Wednesday, May 25th, 2016, and welcome to the BCS Experience. History, arts, culture, politics, in review and discussion. I'm Byron C. Saunders, your host with the most. The BCS Experience takes a look at our rich history, African American history. We're going to share with you some known and unknown historical facts and information from the past and connect the dots on how they have impacted on our present day events and how they will definitely shape our future as African Americans in this country and around the world. The BCS Experience: history, arts, culture, politics, in review and discussion. This is internet radio and will be aired live every Wednesday from 5 to 6 p.m. on the GoPro Radio Network, broadcasting from Iron Metropolis Images. You see, I'm really excited about this opportunity to talk to you all across the country and around the world. I want you to tune in every week on your computer or your phone, and I want you to become a loyal listener, and I personally invite you to lend your voices to this radio talk show to express your opinions on my weekly topics. This is social network radio at its finest. Now, here's the number for you to call in to be a part of tonight's discussion. Call 347-884-9839. Once again, that number to call, 347-884-9839. Now, this week's topic, oh my goodness. The history of the first celebration of Decoration Day, also known as Memorial Day, and the anatomy of a historic Memorial Day tragedy of the total destruction of Black Wall Street. The 1921 Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots, a two-part series. This was and still is America's worst domestic terrorist event ever. Oh my goodness. I bet you didn't know that history, and if you didn't, we're going to explore that tonight and next week as well. This is some deep topics, especially when you consider what Memorial Day is all about. When it got started, Decoration Day, back in 1865, and then 56 years later, the tragedy in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Memorial Day weekend. All right, that's my show. And you know my show is the new Underground Railroad Express. Next stop is your neighborhood. All aboard to freedom and to Freedom Land. All right, now let's get started right into the history. You see, on this date, it's a Monday. It's February, it's May the 1st, 1865. All right. You see, on this date in 1865, former black slave started Memorial Day in America. Now, this occurred in Charleston, South Carolina, to honor 257 dead Civil War soldiers, who had been buried in a mass grave in a Confederate prison camp. They dug up the bodies and worked for 2 weeks to give them a proper burial as gratitude for fighting for their freedom. Now, together with teachers and missionaries, black residents of Charleston organized a May Day ceremony that year, which was covered by the New York Tribune and other national papers. Now, the freedmen cleaned up and landscaped the burial ground, building an enclosure and an arch labeled Martyrs of the Race Course. Nearly 10,000 people, mostly freedmen, gathered on May 1st to commemorate the war dead. Now, involved were about 3,000 black school children newly enrolled in freedmen schools and mutual aid societies, Union troops, black ministers, and white northern missionaries. You see, most brought flowers to be placed on the burial field. Now, years later, the celebration would come to be called the first Decoration Day in the North. David W. Bright described the day. This was the first Memorial Day. African Americans invented Memorial Day in Charleston, South Carolina. Now, what you have there is black Americans recently freed from slavery announcing to the world with flowers, wow, their feet and their songs, what the war had been about. What they basically were creating was the Independence Day of a second American Revolution. Bet you didn't know that. Now, let's look at this tape where we can get a better picture of the celebration itself that happened in Charleston, South Carolina in 1865. Roll that tape.
A most unlikely group of newly freed slaves created what may have been the first Memorial Day. In April 1865, only days after the Civil War ended in a handshake at Appomattox and Lincoln was shot at Ford Theater, a still shocked Southern community found a way to express their gratitude to the fallen. History records that the first nationwide declaration was made to honor the Union dead on May 30th, 1868, by General John A. Logan, Commander-in-Chief of the Grand Army of the Republic. It was later expanded to commemorate all American casualties of any war or military action. It wasn't officially named Memorial Day until 1967, but perhaps the earliest and most spontaneous celebration happened in the days leading up to May 1st, 1865. Charleston, South Carolina was a city devastated by Union bombardment. There, in the final months of the Civil War, a former horse track became a Confederate prison where more than 250 Union soldiers died and were buried in a mass grave. After the surrender, a group of former slaves went to this gravesite. These carpenters and laborers dug up the mass grave. They then carefully reburied each soldier in a proper grave. They also erected a fence around the new cemetery, and they built an arched entryway inscribed with the words, "Martyrs of the Racecourse." And on May 1st, 10,000 local people of all ages and colors came with armloads of flowers. They sang patriotic songs and spirituals. Local preachers made speeches, and the crowd shared a picnic lunch. Finally, Union soldiers paraded around the graves. It was said that when all had left, you couldn't see the mounds of earth for the mass of flowers. A day of remembrance, a Memorial Day, perhaps our first Memorial Day.
Wow. Today, the site is used as Hampton Park. That's American history, ladies and gentlemen. As we about to celebrate a Memorial Day week in 2016, it's quite interesting that the first Memorial Day held by freed slaves, honoring those who fought to give them the freedom in 1865. That's our history. And if you didn't know that, why are you celebrating a holiday that has no meaning? Give honor to our ancestors, folks. American history has a way of stealing things from African Americans and then calling it their own. But this is one day that is ours, unique to our freedom. Decoration Day. All right, now, I want to hear from you. Now, let's connect the dots and let's talk. Let's make sense out of it all. Call me today, 347-884-9839. Once again, that number to call, 347-884-9839. All right, tonight I have a very special guest that's joining us. Joining us in the GoPro studio this evening is you. That's right, my listening audience, with another opportunity to appreciate our rich cultural history and learn how it impacts on our lives today. That is the story on tonight's The BCS Experience. Now, I want to hear from you again. Call me. Let's connect these dots. This is going to be such an interesting evening of history because 56 years after the first Memorial Day celebration, 56 years to the day, we're talking about May 20. This is the May 31st, the destruction of Black Wall Street. Now, this is a two-part series. Series part one. You see, over the next 2 weeks, we're going to take a look at the anatomy of the historic Memorial Day tragedy of the total destruction of Black Wall Street, the 1921 Tulsa race riots. This tragedy, from then until today, is America's worst case of domestic terrorism in the history. And you got to really appreciate the history of this particular event because, folks, when we talk about the Tulsa race riots, when we talk about the riots and disturbances that have happened across America, there is a connection, my people. And when you hear this story, what you think that you may know about Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Greenwood, the community in which white rioting destroyed the richest black town in America in 1921. This story is not taught. It happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Okay, let's get right to it. All right. By the way, you can read a lot of this from Ebony Magazine. Now, the events that destroyed a thriving black Oklahoma community 95 years ago were much more than a race riot. Listen to this. Greenwood, Oklahoma, a suburb of Tulsa, was the type of community that African Americans are still today attempting to reclaim and rebuild. It was modern, majestic, sophisticated, and unapologetically black. Tragically, it was also the site of one of the bloodiest and most horrendous race riots and acts of terrorism that the United States has ever experienced. Today marks 92 years since as many as 300 African Americans lost their lives and more than 9,000 were left homeless when the small town was attacked, looted, and literally burned to the ground beginning in 1921. It's impossible, however, to realize what was lost in Greenwood, which was affectionately known as Black Wall Street. You see, the Greenwood community seems almost imagined when we examine it through a historical lens. Oil booms of the early 1900s had many moving to Tulsa for a shot at quick economic gains and high life. And African Americans hoped to prosper from the new industry as well. You see, Tulsa, like many cities had towns throughout the U.S., was hostility segregated, with African Americans settling into the northern region of the city. As we often saw before integration, blacks in the area created entrepreneurial opportunities for themselves, which housed an impressive business center that included banks, hotels, cafes, clothiers, movie theaters, and contemporary homes. Greenwood residents enjoyed many, many luxuries that their white neighbors did not, including indoor plumbing and a remarkable school system that superiority educated black children. Wow. Imagine that. Okay? 1921. It was pure envy and a vow to put progressive, high-achieving African Americans in their place that would cause the demise of the Black Mecca many called Little Africa. And its destruction began the way such and much terrorism, violence, and dispossession against African Americans did during that era. A young white woman accused a young black man of attempted sexual assault, which gave local mobs and white men acting as police just cause to invade the unsuspecting community. On the malevolent and horrifying attack, Linda Christensen writes the following: "The term race riot does not adequately describe the events of May 31st to June 1st, 1921, in Greenwood. In fact, the term itself implies that both blacks and whites might be equally to blame for the lawlessness and violence. The historical record documents a sustained and murderous assault on black lives and property. This assault was met by a brave but unsuccessful armed defense of their community by some black World War I veterans and others." You see, so often we don't think of ourselves as protecting our own community. Today we have an uprising, and you see us burning what looks like our own invested time and effort of our houses. Most of us don't own those houses, they're rented. So we're not burning our residence. But this incident, I'm going to tell you this, folks, because when I tell you this, you're going to not believe the history of this. But since that event in 1921, I don't care where the uprising has taken place, black people have never destroyed a white town in America after having been oppressed and depressed and violated like these people were in Greenwood, Oklahoma. Never in the history of America have black folks destroyed a white community like this was done to their community in the United States of America. During the night and day of the riot, deputized whites killed more than 300 African Americans. They looted and burned to the ground 40 square blocks of 1,265 African American homes, including hospitals, schools, and churches, and destroyed 150 businesses. White deputies and members of the National Guard arrested and detained 6,000 black Tulsans who were released only upon being vouched for by a white employer or other white citizens. 9,000 African Americans were left homeless and lived in tents well into the winter of 1921. Wow. I mean, just the thought of that, people. Just the thought of that. Living in a tent city into the winter after having your community completely obliterated by white races. All right, you got to listen to more of this because the anatomy of this is speaking volumes to what's going on in our country today. And to understand and appreciate, you got to understand and appreciate when people stand up and demand accountability. Recently, the mother of Palestinian activist friend of mine asked me why African Americans don't fight harder for reparations. It was a difficult question to answer, but my most immediate response centered on the historical erasure of communities like Greenwood and the state-sponsored violence against African Americans that created its expiry. Even after slavery was abolished, any advancements towards the American dream that blacks paid most clear or dearly to establish was met with revulsion and terror, often from those whose legal obligation was to serve and protect. You see, they didn't protect our community, and for that, a debt is surely owed. Further, when we consider the deaths of those black Tulsans and the inevitable property loss that followed, we again see one example of many that proves how wealth, inequities and inequalities and disparities become a part of the substance of this national inequities, and disparities that must be considered before we go blaming black youth for the catastrophes this nation has endorsed. That's right, you can't blame our youth if they're seeing their communities destroyed. They're wide awake, people. Baltimore. You see what happened in Baltimore? And they still can't convict a single police officer? Tell me the youth are not aware and that all they want to do is destroy their community. It was already destroyed. And we can't get justice. And as we consider what has become the new face of terror, we should never forget that Greenwood was bombed from the sky. That's right, they dropped bombs from airplanes on this community by white, local, and national law enforcement organizations. 1921, my friends. That's right. So when you think about 911, when you think about MOVE in Philadelphia, and when you think about all that has happened to our African American communities, then you get an understanding and appreciation of that is 1921, 56 years after the first Memorial Day celebration known as Decoration Day. White rioting destroyed and obliterated the richest black town in America. You don't make this stuff up. This is our history. All right, we're going to take a look at the last survivor of Black Wall Street, Oklahoma disaster. 92-year-old Olivia Hooker speaks. And I've been told we can roll this right into the next break. So take a look at this as she tells you what she experienced as a 6-year-old that day, May 31st, 1921, Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Well, I'm here, and let's put it that way. Olivia Hooker. Hooker, Hooke.
Are you from Oklahoma?
Yep, I'm from Tulsa.
You're the original survivor.
That's right.
Tell me a little bit about your story.
Yes, you do. No. Well,
I'm 77.
well, I'm 95, and I was 6 years old at the time of the disaster. I refuse to call it a riot because it was really, whites decided to burn down the homes of 10,000 people. So that was not a riot. It was planned desecration. And so we were just small children. And my family had not told me about prejudice and hate and things like that. I thought everything in the preamble to the Constitution referred to me. I didn't find out until this terrible night that they...
This was a very prosperous community?
Yes, and they used to call it Black Wall Street. But it wasn't Wall Street, but, it was a prosperous community. But it was all 10,000 people, counting all the children and grown-up children, who were made homeless by this riot, so what they called a riot. And it was 80 years before the state of Oklahoma actually had a commission to study it and remove the blame from us as victims and put the blame where it belonged on the Ku Klux.
What year was this?
1921. And as I say, my sisters and brothers knew about prejudice, but at that time I thought everything that we were taught at school actually existed. And so it was more devastating for me because it was such a shock. And when the mobs came in, they had those pine, knots all lighted up, and they set things on fire. And my mother refused to run because she was busy putting water on the house to try to keep it from burning. And so she put the children under the big oak table. They had those great big tables in those days with little nooks under them. So we were under the table when the mobs came in, and my mother had said, well, we have to eat no matter what. So she was cooking,
That
and
is true.
they got so angry that she had what she called her three-cornered pots on the stove, and she had something different in each pot. So they took those out and threw them in the backyard. Then they came back and took the beautiful brown biscuits out of the oven and took them out and smashed them in the mud. And see, we're under the table looking at all this, and so it was very devastating for me because I hadn't known about those things. You see, the only non-black people that I ever saw were people who wanted to sell my father things for his store. And they brought presents for the children and listened to my sister play the piano, you know, how salesmen behave. I thought that's the way all non-black people behaved. I had no idea. And when they broke up my mother's Caruso records, and that broke her heart. But they didn't break the old rugged cross. You see, they're giving you a message. The old rugged cross, you see. See, they're giving you a message, what you should and shouldn't have. And they took the hatchets and chopped my sister's piano, but they didn't know that it's the sounding board in the piano that is important. So they chopped the outside of the piano, and it didn't affect the tone of it, you know. And they took my mother's luggage, but they didn't take my sister's little wicker basket. They took my mother's pigskin luggage. But being a psychologist,
You're a psychologist?
yeah,
Oh my goodness.
I received my PhD at the University of Rochester.
Rochester's New York State, yeah. Wow, my goodness. As a psychologist, you came to the New York area, right?
Well, I came to go to Columbia University.
You went to Columbia.
After the war.
We can roll it, silence it from here.
Yes.
But I wanted you to hear that voice. This is a woman who was very learned, had her degree, but at 6 years old, look what she had to witness. They didn't have psychologists to come and give the people of Tulsa and Greenwood community an opportunity to decompress after being forced to be a witness to this. This is the kind of stuff that you can't even imagine. You can't even imagine how a 6-year-old would take this and watching her home, her life completely and obliterated and destroyed by hatred. Tulsa, Oklahoma, folks. Listen, I want to hear from you. Let's connect the dots and make sense out of it all. You can call, talk to me, because we're going to tell you the anatomy of this. I got to take a break here. But when we come back, I'm going to give you the anatomy and the breakdown of the days and chronological events and how it all happened in 1921, also known as the destruction of Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma race riots. We'll be right back after these very important messages.
You're listening to content developed by the GoPro Radio Network, the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
We interrupt this broadcast to bring you a great opportunity. If you have a product or a service, a talent, or something important to say, now's your chance. You can have your very own radio show. Whether you're just starting out or a veteran looking for a professional platform to enhance your presentation, the GoPro Radio Network is the premier place to cultivate and share new and exciting content. We'll help you grow your audience and keep it growing long after your first broadcast. Now you have a voice. Call 212-696-8562 today. Visit www.goproradio.com and you'll be amazed at how easy and affordable it is to have your very own radio show on the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
You're listening to content developed by the GoPro Radio Network, the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
Are you ready for this?
Are you ready for this? I'm ready for this. Now, we're talking about Memorial Day and what it means to us as African Americans. I just started off the show sharing with you how it got started. It wasn't started by white America. It was started by African Americans celebrating and honoring those Civil War soldiers in 1865 who freed them from the tyranny of slavery in the United States of America. That's how Memorial Day got started. That's why we celebrate. That's why we have barbecue. We have such amazing Memorial Day celebrations. Then 56 years later, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Greenwood subcommunity of Tulsa, Oklahoma, hold that right there, to Khadijah, because at the moment, I'm going to tell you the anatomy of what happened for the worst domestic terrorist event in the history of the United States of America, bigger than 9/11. Oh yeah, y'all think 9/11 was this monumental act of terrorism. Oh no. 1921, Memorial Day weekend, Tulsa, Oklahoma, the destruction of America's richest black town. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood community, 1921. Now here's the anatomy, and this is how it happened. Tulsa, 1921. It's one of the worst race riots the nation's history occurred in Tulsa over a 14-hour period on May 31st through June 1st, 1921. You see, dozens of people were killed, hundreds were injured, and thousands were left homeless. Most of the segregated black district, known as Greenwood, was destroyed. And although the riot itself lasted only a few hours, its repercussions are still felt today, 2016. You see, the Tulsa of 1921 was a humming, bustling place that reveled in the title, oil capital of the world. It had earned the name by making itself into a financial, manufacturing, and transportation hub of the great mid-continent oil fields surrounding it. And from barely 1,000 inhabitants in 1898, it had grown to more than 72,000. Tulsa County's population was about 110,000, making it the most densely populated and fastest growing county in the state. Most Tulsans were what you would call native born and white. A surprisingly small number, fewer than 1,000, identified themselves as American Indians. Now about 9,000 were black, with most of them living in the community centered on Greenwood Avenue, northeast of downtown Tulsa. Most black Tulsans worked as laborers and domestics, but a substantial number were teachers, lawyers, doctors, and other professionals. Tulsa, like the rest of Oklahoma, was racially segregated. Greenwood had its own schools, its own post office substation, its own police station, and its own branch library. It also had its own thriving commercial district, which Booker T. Washington himself called the Black Wall Street of America. Now, during the course of the investigation, a Southern Methodist minister named Harold Cook touched on underlying racial tensions. An open proponent of vigilantism and unabashed racist, Cook complained bitterly of blacks and whites drinking and dancing together in roadhouses and speakeasies, and of black porters in cheap hotels acting as agents for white prostitutes. Now, you got to picture this, folks. You see, it was at that time that the country was going through flappers. Women were liberating themselves. Y'all read The Great Gatsby. It's a high school demanded reading. But that's what was going on the East Coast, while this was going on in 1921 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So now you're talking about the race mixing. Now you're talking about white and blacks dancing together. Oh, my goodness. Oh, my goodness. In 1921, who would have thought jazz was getting started back in those days? Okay. So we continue in Tulsa, as in the rest of Oklahoma and throughout the United States, race was an important issue. Many states, including Oklahoma, tried to keep blacks from, tried to keep blacks from voting like today and restricted their activities, sometimes through so-called Jim Crow laws and sometimes through intimidation. Increasingly, blacks resisted discrimination from Washington, D.C. to Chicago to the rural Arkansas Delta. Racial conflict degenerated into deadly armed violence. In fact, as they called it, the Red Summer of 1919, this is when race issues were uprisings all across the country. The Ku Klux Klan, which had gotten started in 1871, right along with the NRA. Did you know that? See how they worked hand in hand? Gun rights, arming the Southerners to protect themselves against what? African Americans. So you think about 2016 and what the NRA and all these folks buying guns today started back in 1871, people. That's why you've got to understand the impact and importance of our African American history, which is American history. See, though far from ideal, Tulsa was considered a better place than most for blacks. Besides the thriving business district, Greenwood attracted a relatively large number of doctors, lawyers, and teachers. Its schools, though poorly funded, were exceptional. The Tulsa Star, a lively weekly newspaper edited by A.G. Smitherman, promoted independence and unity and exhorted blacks to stand up for their rights. Wow. 3 weeks before the riot, a middle-aged black couple was arrested in Tulsa for refusing to sit at the back of a streetcar. They were fined $10. Now, hold it right there, because you want to think about Rosa Parks. This is 1921, people. You see, Rosa Parks came after a succession of other heroes and sheroes. So imagine 1921, the protest for not wanting to sit in the back of a streetcar. They were fined $10. Wow. Amazing. All right, we move forward. The incident itself. You see, on Monday, May 30th, 1921, a young black man named Dick Rowland got onto an elevator on the third floor of the Drexel building at 319 South Main Street. For some reason, he came into contact with Sarah Page, the white elevator operator, and Page cried out. Her cry was heard by a store clerk who called the police. Now, the Drexel building at 319 South Main Street was 4 stories tall. Reinberg's department store occupied the first 2 floors, with offices and small businesses upstairs. Now, the building was probably quiet that morning. Well, it was Memorial Day, and most downtown stores, including Reinberg's, were closed. Rain. Oh, my goodness, it was raining that day. So it put a damper on activities, including the parade. Now, although Dick Rowland, slow that down, back it up a little bit. Although Dick Rowland seems to have been fairly well known, his true identity is a bit of a mystery. See, he's generally identified as the son of Dave and Alice Ollie Rowland, who operated a boarding house in the Pico or Pyro building on East Archer Street. So now some sources, though, say his name was actually John or Johnny Rowland, and that he was an adopted son or even Garth's grandson of Dave Rowland. Now, Damie Rowland, Dave and Alice's daughter, said in a 1972 interview that she had taken in young Johnny while living in Bonita, and that he had been born in Arkansas. Now, the 1920 census, listing for the Rowland household includes an adopted son named John, who had been born in Texas. Now, adding to the uncertainty is a slight age discrepancy. You see, the census recorded John Rowland's age as 16 in 1920. Slow that down. Back that up. That's right. At 16, Dick Rowland's age when he was arrested a year later was given as 19. So, almost nothing is known of Sarah Page. That's the young white girl. Originally described as a 17-year-old orphan working her way through business college. It later developed that she may have been as young as 15 and had come to Tulsa from Kansas City while waiting for a divorce to be finalized. Wait a minute. Hold on a second. You mean to tell me this young lady was 15 and in a divorce procedure? Where were her parents? This story gets even more and more imagined as you can only go forward. Now, people who knew Rowland said the elevator did not stop level with the third floor threshold, causing him to trip as he entered the car and fall against Miss Page. Police later said that whatever happened, it was almost certainly not intentional. And in any case, Page's cry caught the attention of a Rhinenberg employee who apparently summoned police. Rowland fled, but Page and the clerk, if not actually naming the man she said attacked her, supplied enough of a description that authorities had no difficulty locating him. Wow. It always starts with a white woman's scream. Wow. That's how it started for Emmett Till. You see? You got to connect these dots, folks. These are not accidental incidences where in this country, and I got to say this. Okay, we're looking at 2016, and you look across America, and you look at Donald Trump, and you look at the incidences and his rallies, and you don't see a lot of black people there. And when you do see them, they're getting hostile and mistreated. Okay, but we're not talking about an isolated incident. This is going back in 1921, where a white woman screamed. Emmett Till, a white woman protesting against a 14-year-old. Okay, and this continues even as we go forward today. So, moving forward, the anatomy of Tulsa, Oklahoma, and what happened. Guess what? Then it was established, nabbed the Negro for attacking a girl in the elevator. Oh my goodness. Rowland's arrest the next morning was reported in a front page story in that afternoon's Tulsa Tribune, headlined, "Nab Negro for attacking a girl in the elevator." The somewhat sensational account reported accurately, if perhaps imprudently, that Rowland was to be charged with attempted assault. It said Rowland scratched Page and tore her clothes. Did you hear what I just said? He would... I can't even think that a young man would be so stupid as to do something like that in a building where most white folks would be. So it's a trumped up case. I'm going to use Trump's name. Yeah, it was a trumped up case. And this is the parlance of the day was tantamount to an accusation of attempted rape. The mere suggestion of attempted assault when it involved a white woman had in the past triggered gruesome lynchings from Duluth, Minnesota to the Florida swamps. Wow. And then the cry that followed next is, "We're going to lynch that Negro." At 4 p.m. on that same day, an anonymous caller told Police Commissioner J.M. Atkinson, "We are going to lynch that Negro, that black devil who assaulted that girl." Atkinson and Police Chief John Gustafson arranged to move Rowland from the city jail to the more secure county lockup on the top floor of the courthouse at 6th Street and Boulder Avenue. Whites attracted by the rumors began gathering at the courthouse until they numbered an estimated 2,000. Atkinson and Gustafson wanted Sheriff Willard McCullough to take Rowland out of town, but McCullough refused. He reasoned that Rowland was safer in the jail than in a car on an open road somewhere. And in this, McCullough was no doubt correct, but there is some indication that Atkinson and Gustafson thought spiriting Rowland out of town would disperse the crowd. This was, in fact, a tactic that had worked elsewhere. No, rather than risk trying to sneak Rowland out of town, McCullough put him in a cell, ordered the only elevator to the jail disabled, and had 6 of his deputies barricade themselves inside with the prisoner. McCullough deputy Barney Cleaver and County Commissioner Ira Short remained behind with McCullough, and Cleaver, a black man with a long career in Tulsa law enforcement, trying to disperse the crowd outside. Interestingly, no police seem to have been in evidence at the courthouse. Some sources say bad relations between the sheriff's and police departments contributed to the failure to control the situation before it got out of hand. You don't think, really? Got to take a break here, folks, because we're going through the anatomy of a race riot that completely destroyed 10,000 lives in Tulsa, Oklahoma. This is our American history. You need to never forget it. We'll be right back after these very important messages from GoPro Radio.
You're listening to content developed by the GoPro Radio Network, the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
The views and opinions expressed on GoPro Radio Network shows are solely those of the speakers and are not necessarily the views or opinions of GoPro Radio Network, Inc. or its affiliates. These broadcasts are provided on the understanding that they do not constitute professional advice or services. Individuals who speak on these broadcasts express their own opinions, experiences, and conclusions. GoPro Radio Networks and its affiliates do not necessarily endorse or oppose any particular opinion or conclusion discussed in these broadcasts. You may not edit or modify or redistribute these broadcasts in any way without the express permission from GoPro Radio, LLC. GoPro Radio assumes no liability for any of your activities in connection with our broadcasts or for your use of these broadcasts in connection with your website, computer, smartphone, tablet, iPad, or future listening devices. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
What if you can have an entire team of skilled professionals to help your business grow? Admin, accounts, marketing, and more, but only pay for the exact amount of support you need at virtually the same cost you'd pay for one full-time employee. With Virtual Professions, you can. One contact, one number gets you a team of virtual professionals for exactly what your business needs. It's 1-888-315-VPRO. That's 1-888-315-8776. Or online at www.virtualprofessions.net. Virtual Professions Incorporated, because you mean business.
You're listening to content developed by the GoPro Radio Network, the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
All right already. Hey,
Ready for this?
I'm so ready for this. I'm Byron C. Saunders, your host with the most. We are on the BCS Experience. We're talking about Memorial Day celebration. What does it really mean to African Americans? It means a time of remembrance. It means a time that you must realize that we started the first Memorial Day celebration. It was better known as Decoration Day, 1865, Charleston, South Carolina, where African Americans were honoring those who gave their lives in the Civil War. 10,000 people showed up in Charleston on a racetrack. It's better known today as Hampton Park. 56 years later, in Tulsa, Oklahoma, Memorial Day weekend, the most devastating domestic terrorist event in the nation's history, including 9/11. Yes, y'all remember when the Twin Towers went down, but y'all need to remember Tulsa, Oklahoma, Greenwood community, where white rioting and racism destroyed the richest black town in America in Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921. So we're giving you the anatomy of what happened. See, it's important for us to realize and remember the history, because the anatomy of what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma is very similar to other events, uprisings in America when it comes to African Americans in our community and the treatment of African Americans. So on this Memorial Day, 2016, we look back in time to give honor to those who lost their lives, lost their property, lost much of their life in America after being freed 56 years hence. Interesting. So, anatomy of a riot, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, Memorial Day weekend. Rising tension. You see, responding to the growing crowd at the courthouse and fears fanned by phone calls from unidentified sources for Roland's safety, a group of black men assembled at the offices of A.J. Smitherman's newspaper, the Tulsa Star, on North Greenwood Avenue. And after arming themselves, they marched and drove to the courthouse. Sheriff McCullough said Barney Cleaver, one of his black deputies, was the first to inform him of the threats on Roland's life. Cleaver, the sheriff said, had telephoned to tell him of a call apparently similar to the one to Atkinson received at Northside Motion Picture Theater. You see, at least two earlier contingents of concerned blacks had already visited the courthouse. McCullough and Cleaver assured them that Roland was in good hands and persuaded them to return to Greenwood. The intent of the white crowd is difficult to gauge. Not surprisingly, officials later described the white crowd, at least initially, as more curious than hostile. Without radio, much less television, the only way to see what was happening was to go in person. But the crowd was not completely docile either. McCullough was hooted down, the world reported, when he tried to disperse the whites. Shortly before the shooting started, a band of irate whites presented themselves at the National Guard Armory about a mile east of the courthouse, demanding weapons and threatening to break in when they were denied. In any event, McCullough said that the only effort to get at Roland occurred at 8:20 p.m. when three unidentified white men entered the courthouse. I told them there had been some talk of a lynching, and that they might as well get out, for no one was going to get the Negro, McCullough said. They went out and got into an auto on Boulder Street and talked loudly, gesticulated, and soon a crowd gathered. The shot fired. At about 10 p.m., a former county investigator named E.S. McQueen confronted a black man, sometimes identified as Johnny Cole, in front of the courthouse, and as McQueen and Cole wrestled over the latter's gun, it discharged. As more than one person observed, all hell broke loose. Denied weapons at the National Guard Armory? Whites, including some police, broke into Barden's Sporting Goods at 510 South Main Street across the street from the courthouse and began taking guns. These are white folks, taking guns and ammunition and just about everything else in sight. Not black people rioting and destroying and looting. These were white people who were doing that. Police involvement may be partially explained by the fact that Barden seems to have sold ammunition to the department on a regular basis. Looting, all of it by rampaging whites, was reported throughout downtown as shots whizzed haphazardly. Gustafson called in his entire force, around 65 men, and Atkinson began commissioning special deputies, perhaps as many as 400 of them. Oklahoma National Guard Adjutant General Charles Barrett told Colonel L.J.F. Rooney, senior officer in Tulsa, to make his troops available to local authorities, even though it would be hours before they could be officially called to duty. The first few guardsmen to arrive at police headquarters found the street choked with men in uniform. American Legion members assembled in formation. You see, remember, it was Memorial Day weekend. They were preparing for a parade, and all these former World War I veterans in their uniforms out there in the streets. And although no doubt well-intentioned, their presence initially added to the general chaos. So here you got crowd of white folks, regular citizens who had just looted the gun store, took the ammunition out in the streets with the folks who were about to get into the parade for Memorial Day service weekends in their World War I outfits and probably some in their Confederate outfits. All these white folks in the streets wreaking havoc. According to the World, shooting continued for 2 hours over the city and centered in the north part of the business district until the last of the blacks had retreated into Greenwood. And then there was a lull. The shots at the courthouse touched off 2 hours of fighting and general chaos in downtown Tulsa, culminating in the return of Rowland's intended protectors to the Greenwood area shortly after midnight. And the handful of National Guardsmen available, along with some volunteers, tried to get between the combatants along the Frisco Railroad tracks and Detroit Avenue. And although the fighting never completely stopped, it did die down during the early morning hours, causing many to believe the riot was playing itself out. And then dawn came. At dawn, a force of citizens, police, and members of the National Guard, numbering perhaps 1,500, moved into Greenwood from the south and the west under orders to take into protective custody unarmed blacks and to subdue any who resisted. To people in Greenwood, it looked more like an invading army. It then dawned upon us that the enemy had organized in the night and was invading our district. The same as the Germans invaded France and Belgium, wrote Mary Jones Parrish, a Greenwood resident who recorded her experience and those of some of her neighbors in a pamphlet called Events of the Tulsa Disaster. Authorities, still operating on the premise of a Negro uprising, maintained that they wanted to get control of Greenwood, not destroy it. They failed on both counts. Most Greenwood residents surrendered peacefully or fled northward. Many were hidden by employers or other acquaintances, and sometimes even total strangers. The few who stayed behind to fight were overwhelmed. The National Guard reported engaging in several short skirmishes as it moved down from Standpipe Hill, the hill just west of the present Oklahoma State University, Tulsa campus, and one longer battle in which about 50 blacks fought like tigers. The last organized resistance came from gunmen in the Mount Zion Baptist Church tower. They were refused to come out, and the church, valued at $80,000, was set on fire and completely destroyed. Wow. We're going to stop here because this is 2 parts, folks. Part 2, we're going to come back next week, and we're going to talk to you about how airplanes dropped bombs on these African Americans. That's right. As you reflect on Memorial Day and the celebration this weekend of honoring all the soldiers. No, stop it right there. You must honor the people of Greenwood, Tulsa, Oklahoma, and how white racism destroyed the richest black town in America. You've been listening to the BCS Experience on the GoPro Radio Network. We're going to be back next week with part 2, because you need to hear the rest of this story as you eat some fried chicken and some barbecue and some potato salad this weekend. Give honor to the ancestors, because they gave honor to us. This has been the BCS Experience, and I'm Byron C. Saunders, your host with the most. See you next week.
You're listening to content developed by the GoPro Radio Network, the fastest growing network in the galaxy. GoPro Radio Network. Listen to the voices in your head.
All right. Good show, folks. Thank you very much. It's not an easy job, is it? But you want to be behind the camera.